Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to IPI for this policy forum on nonviolent action versus violent extremism, the strategic and appealing choice for addressing grievances, organized in partnership with the U.S. Institute for Peace and the Permanent Mission of Norway to the United Nations. Violent extremism continues to pose a significant global threat. Groups continue to attract and recruit, while responses aimed at addressing the root causes of this violence fail to take a holistic approach that could definitively weaken the basis of these groups' ideologies. Much policy discussion at the national and multilateral levels continues to focus on the military response to violent extremism, to addressing the immediate threat, despite the fact that military responses have demonstrated limits in addressing grievances and may unintentionally exacerbate them. Research has shown that nonviolent action, rooted in communities and relying on the collective action of ordinary people, can be an alternative pathway to address grievances and thus prevent further violence. Nonviolent action offers the sense of belonging, agency, and the search for identity that often motivates individuals to join violent extremist groups, in particular youth. Today's event aims to shed light on nonviolent action by looking at the factors, including neuroscience-related factors, behind the choices individuals make in pursuit of divergent paths. We'll also discuss how policymakers can better support individuals and groups working through nonviolent action to address drivers of violent extremism at the grassroots level. To help us further our understanding of the potential of nonviolent action, we've gathered a distinguished panel here today. Before I turn to the panel, I'd like to give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Norway, Mari Skara, and take this opportunity to thank Norway for its continuous support to IPI. Ambassador, you have the floor.
It's great to come here. It feels like coming to my second home. It's also very nice to be back in the UN context, coming from the position as ambassador in Afghanistan. So I'm very appreciative of the organizers for this event, and I want to say thank you so much to IPI and USIP for organizing this. I also want to say thank you to the participants, the panelists, for what they are about to share with us. I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentations and also listening to the debate. The threat from violent extremism remains very high around the globe and continues to evolve. Its causes are complex, and the conduct of such acts are not limited to one ideology, religion, or system of belief. The consequences are horrific for the civilian population and for our societies. Violent extremism poses a threat to all of us. It's a national threat. It's a global threat. I have seen the pain, the grievance, the suffering that such acts causes in my own country. I have seen it in Afghanistan. Violent extremism raises the level of conflicts in our societies. And we know that women and girls often are harder hit than men. In particular, where you see sexual and gender-based violence used as a method to create fear and damage to the population. Violent extremism creates fears, and it creates stifled development. It hinders economic and social growth. It hinders prosperity. And today we meet to discuss why some people turn to violent extremism as a response to grievances, whatever they might be, while others opt for non-violent action. And we are very glad for this opportunity to learn more. We need the analysis, and we need good strategies, comprehensive, long-term strategies tailored to the specific context. Now, former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's plan, UN Plan of Action, lays out the policy frameworks and priority areas to address common drivers of violent extremism. These can be factors such as lack of social economic opportunities, marginalization, poor governance, and the violence of violation of human rights. Such grievances and hunger, perhaps, for meaning and inclusion, I have learned, can lead individuals, particularly young people, to violent extremism. Terrorism and violent extremism can never be justified, regardless of motivation. However, our response to extreme violence cannot solely rely on military force and post-the-fact solutions. The complex nature of this phenomenon presents us with a very demanding situation. And by increasing the focus on the preventive measures against violent extremism, we are shifting towards a more proactive mode. I would like to highlight 3 points we believe in Norway are important in our endeavors. First, we must recognize that national governments have the primary responsibility to countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism. We do, however, as governments, need partnerships, and governments should work closely with a range of stakeholders, including within civil society, as we do in Norway through our National Action Plan. Women, youth, local authorities play an important role in efforts to tackle these threats and challenges. Extremists understand the power of women and youth, so they want us on their side. We need to understand the social construct and roles in our society. We need to have a gender perspective. Second point, Agenda 2030, and particularly the Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peaceful and inclusive societies, establishes that security and development are mutually reinforcing. The high ambitions set for the agenda can simply not be achieved without integrating the prevention of violent extremism. Third point, we must ensure that all efforts to address terrorism and prevent violent extremism are respectful of rule of law and in accordance with international law, in particular human rights, refugee law, and the humanitarian law. A growing body of evidence shows that human rights violations by states, whether real or perceived, are often the tipping point for individuals to become radicalized to violence. So in conclusion, our challenges are shared to prevent and resolve the threats posed by violent extremism and to find good solutions for a common future. We need a strong UN. We need a UN showing global leadership. We need the knowledge, advice, and leadership of academia and other parts of civil society, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. Let me now introduce our panel. So, to my immediate left, Noella Richard is the Youth Global Program Manager at UNDP's Bureau for Policy and Program Support, Governance, and Peacebuilding Cluster, and Michael Nikinchuk, Senior Researcher at the Beyond Conflict Innovation Lab for Neuroscience and Social Conflict. Then to my immediate right, Dr. Nilofer Saki, Lecturer of Global Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University, and Dr. Maria Stefan, USIP's Director of Program on Nonviolent Action. After the panel discussion, we'll have a question and answer, and then I'm going to invite Leanne Erdberg, who's Director of USIP's Countering Violent Extremism Program, to make closing remarks. So with that, let me now turn to you, Noella, to kick us off and to talk about the UN's perspective on countering violent extremism, in particular youth.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me thank IPI and USIP for inviting UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, to join this event. I'm delighted to be on this panel with you, in particular as the demand for development-oriented PV response has really increased and boomed actually over the past years. And since we've just recently completed a new research called Frontlines on the positive role of young people in preventing violent extremism with the generous support by the government of Norway through our Oslo Governance Center. I'm also excited to be part of this conversation a few months after the launch of two important studies and frameworks, the missing piece on youth peace and security, the independent study mandated by the Security Council Resolution 2250, and the new UN Youth Strategy, Youth 2030, which both, I think, need to inform our discussions and actions when it comes to meaningfully engaging youth as we move forward, including in the context of PVE. So my brief remarks will focus on UNDP's approach, UNDP's approach to PVE through development solutions, and some examples of partnerships with young women and young men seen as positive agents of change in the context of PVE. So why do we focus on development solutions? Well, violent extremism, we know, is often a reaction to a perceived failure in development by specific social groups, by specific communities that may have suffered inequalities, often in addition to facing multiple cycles of violence and poverty. So these horizontal inequalities, injustice, socioeconomic exclusion, distrust to the government, together really create the perfect storm generally for recruitment and for violent extremism. We also know, and that was mentioned already, that we will not win that battle only with security measures, and certainly not just with hardline security approaches. The contrary, this has often fueled violent extremist activities. I will refer to the UNDP Journey to Extremism in Africa study that you may have seen. It, for instance, showed that 71% of the recruits say that government action, most often the killing or arrest of a family member or a friend, actually was the tipping point that made them decide to join a violent extremist group. So we really believe that security measures must be complemented with multidisciplinary approaches to prevention. It has to be anchored in tolerance, in political and economic empowerment, and really address inequalities and marginalization of all, and particularly young people, who often represent the vast majority of the population of the countries we're talking about, that often are targeted for recruitment, and nonetheless also represent the groups that are at the forefront of the prevention of violent extremism as well. So that means that clearly the respect and the promotion for diversity, for inclusivity, for human rights has to be at the heart of our action. And to make that happen, definitely need to partner with women's organizations, with youth organizations, movements, and networks as champions. On youth empowerment specifically, we have begun, I would say, by challenging a number of assumptions about the role that young people play. Even though the young age of many of the recruits and perpetrators have placed them at the center of this phenomenon, it's important to remember that only a minuscule fraction of the world's young people will ever be interested in joining violent groups or will be engaged with these movements. And we often forget that, and often, in a way, are ourselves victim to some kind of policy panics, as the lead author of the Youth, Peace and Security study mentioned. So not only are young people commonly the victims of various forms of violence, they're also the victims of the response, of the collateral damage related to the spread of intolerance, related to surveillance, related to the intimidation, really, in multiple forms, in spaces of recreation, in spaces for civic engagement. So what we do is try to nurture youth-led activism and really emphasize the importance of enhancing youth positive resilience. It's important to remember as well that young people that want to make a difference and are engaged with activism very often work in difficult conditions, very often for free, very often in unstable environments, and are facing the full spectrum of the root causes, really, of violent extremism themselves. What is really interesting is that young people are already at the heart of the response in a number of areas: in education, in media, in supporting advocacy campaigns, not just online but also offline ones, in mobilizing university students, in contributing to research. So we certainly see a good momentum now with all these different frameworks converging to emphasizing the importance of youth agency as a great opportunity. I will simply, before concluding, give you some examples of our field work in countries with emerging risks of extremism and radicalization leading to violence and terrorism, such as Central Asia, East and South Asia, the Caribbean. UNDP focuses on breaking the cycle of violent extremism by promoting social participation, economic inclusion, by sponsoring activities of cross-border cooperation. In Kenya, UNDP has been working with young people from communities affected either as epicenter or spillover areas of violent extremism. These efforts to prevent violent extremism involved community awareness campaigns with 27 universities, 2,000 young people from 30 different communities who either were victims of violence or had been identified as at risk of recruitment. In Sudan, we recently launched a space called a youth breathing space, where young people can in a way exchange on their experiences, have a local space for safe dialogue, and promote their own agency and their role in social cohesion in their community. In Bangladesh, we promote young people's digital literacy, their ability to spot fake news, to become more digitally aware online. I'm almost concluding. And the last example, in Asia Pacific, it's a very recent partnership that will be formally launched in mid-November, a partnership with YouTube's Creators for Change. It's fundamentally a grassroots program to ensure that young people can connect and speak out against online hate, extremist ideology. We're working with, at the moment, 12 young creators in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines to basically launch that program. So that's it. I mean, to conclude with really, sorry for being a bit long, I will simply say that engaging with young people in a tokenistic way or engaging with them as liabilities will never suffice as a genuine preventive approach, and will actually make damage. So I think we have at the moment a real opportunity to align our action and to really pursue this inclusive approach. So look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Noella. Michael, let me turn to you next to tease out some of the connections from your research on essentially the neuroscience behind extremism, but also the neuroscience behind, in a way, the choices that youth and others take when deciding whether or not to join up with violent extremist groups.
Thank you, Jake. And I have a cold, so I don't usually sound like this. The first thing I would urge everyone to think about is to be incredibly skeptical of everything I'm going to say. Because there's a trend I'm sure you've seen of putting the word neuro in front of anything, and automatically those people that do that get invited to panels like this. So be skeptical, as am I. And I hope I'm captaining this ship wisely. So there's a couple of key areas in neuroscience that we have to delve into when talking about any potential linkages between the understanding of violent extremism and the human brain. The scary thing about studying this from a neuroscience lens is that the more you realize that we all share quite similar brains, the scarier the world becomes. But there's 4 big areas that we try to study when looking at the linkages between neuroscience and violent extremism. The first one is group affiliation. Why humans evolutionarily, biologically, neuroscientifically join groups. It's a fundamental human need. If you don't think that humans have an intense need to belong, I encourage you to look at data on loneliness and opioid addiction. That'll prove you otherwise. The second is threat perception, understanding how and why the human brain deals with threats that are constructed based on actual physical threats in the lived environment or perceived threats, we've inherited an evolutionary threat response system that doesn't really distinguish between imagined identity-based threats or physical safety threats. So the two are handled quite similarly in the brain and body. The third is intergroup cognition, understanding that when you combine A and B, when you combine the need to belong and a high propensity for understanding and feeling threatened, it really affects how groups perceive each other. If you're from a threatened group, it's naturally going to affect how you perceive and actually process visually members of outgroups. And the last one, and I put this sort of tangentially because it's related and sort of an undercurrent in all of this, is the role of mental health and trauma. That there's an anecdotally high link between early childhood trauma and participation in violent extremist organizations, and that should not be overlooked. Every extremist that I've met has had serious childhood wounds of some kind, whether it's a relationship with a parent, history of alcoholism, or other sort of, mental health challenge in their upbringing. Where you belong and what makes you feel threatened affects so many different systems in your body, all the way from how your eyes interpret scenes in the world around you. If you belong to a particular group, let's say that I strongly identify with Hispanic Americans, over time, your visual cortex has a way of actually being able to read and recognize the faces of those group members faster. So where you belong affects how you process the visual world around you. It affects how you perceive other groups. Things like empathy and dehumanization are closely tied to where you have decided to affiliate yourself or what affiliative groups you were born into. And lastly, it affects your physiology. Where you belong and what makes you feel threatened affects the speed with which your sweat glands open and close in response to different threatening stimuli in your environment. There's a landmark study in the Netherlands not that long ago where they put kind of racist white Dutch people in a immersive reality chamber and had them interact in this virtual reality environment with stereotypically Muslim-looking faces. And they noticed a tremendous difference with those who identified more strongly with Dutch Christian culture and the speed with which their sweat glands opened in response to those Muslim faces and the rate of their heart as assessed by wearing a Fitbit. So in general, this is the chemical symbol for oxytocin. That's nerdy. But the degree to which you belong or perceive that you belong to any given identity group, like I said, affects the speed with which you recognize faces of in and out group members. It affects how you perceive physical attributes of those that are from your group. Generally, if you feel a strong sense of power in the group that you belong to, and you're asked to draw the human form of the stereotypical group member, you're going to notice a height difference. You're going to notice a musculature difference. You're going to notice a width difference in the body that people draw, that young people draw, when drawing members of their in-groups versus those of out-groups who are often drawn as weak, as shorter, as thinner. You're going to notice certain interesting phenomena around intergroup dehumanization of failing to consider the humanity or the mind and mental capacities of other groups. You'll notice a change in intergroup cooperation when groups feel threatened and trust each other more, and you can induce this, fun fact, by giving some intranasal oxytocin to groups of business school students. When you create groups artificially or in a natural environment and then you make them feel a high sense of trust with each other, you actually will notice that when you then make them threatened, so tightly knit group, highly trusting group, introduce the paradigm of threat, all of a sudden their willingness to cooperate across group lines plummets. And that's documented across studies. And you'll also notice in a context of both strong intra-group trust and perceived threat, that the quality of intra-group decision-making, of efficacious decisions among group members, skyrockets. And lastly, in the context of perceived threat to an in-group, you'll notice a tremendous consolidation of norms, a radicalization of norms, if you will. And you see this in violent and non-violent movements alike. When a group's identity is in any way threatened, there's generally a consolidation of norms and shrinking of norms around a few core concepts that then signal this is who you have to be. And any deviation from that risks being ostracized from the group. And again, these systems that we have are quite ancient. So what is the worst thing that could possibly happen in a time of threat if you're a gazelle, if you're a chimp, if you're any social species? You're by yourself because you'll be dead. So the human brain and body tend to avoid that potential ostracism at all costs, even if it means giving up ethical values and norms that were once considered dear. So to summarize all of that, we have to look at this in the context of threatened identities. And this is something that can happen for both violent groups and even non-violent groups. because in some ways a sense of injustice, of grievance, is a threat. It's a threat often induced vis-a-vis a group that has a higher level of power, as was just mentioned in the context of perceived injustice being a form of threat to a group, because this is often done by a governing body. So when in a context of threatened identities, you notice a strong increase in an individual's affiliative needs. So a need to belong tends to increase when there's a sense of threat in the environment. That makes sense. But as does prejudice for non-group members, as does norm conformity within the group, and physiological arousal or stimulation to outgroup members. So your amygdala will fire faster the more that you feel threatened in the presence of outgroup members. And in that context as well, you'll notice a decline in executive function, which includes things like short-term working memory, analytical reasoning, higher order cognition. You'll also notice a decrease in positive attitudes, so an arrival of negative attitudes on the intergroup landscape, a decrease in intergroup cooperation, and in those behaviors. And some things that we're doing in the lab in cooperation with some partners here include creating new evidence-based stratcoms platforms that actually target particular cognitive mechanisms, because extremist groups are quite good at tapping into a lot of these emotions and sort of psychobiological systems. So how do we take a lesson out of their playbook of what they're doing right and hack into some of those systems, but to design messaging framework from a psychological and bio-neuroscientific perspective? The second, and this shout out to USIP here for working on this with us, comparing group cohesion and biopsychosocial indicators in violent versus nonviolent groups, because the two can potentially fill very, very similar evolutionary needs around belonging, meaning, significance, status, but there's a key difference when you put a gun in someone's hand and when you don't. And we're very, very bad and not creative at designing nonviolent interventions that facilitate group cohesion, but that also imbue a sense of meaning or confer a sense of meaning. It's easier to make change when you have an AK-47 than if you're picking up trash, right? And I've seen this in the case in Jordan, in the push for volunteerism, which is never going to be an antidote to violent extremism because it's not agency conferring and it doesn't actually lead to change. But the question is, from a neuroscientific lens, what are the design principles that you need to incorporate into nonviolent movements to ensure that they are meeting some of the same needs that are being currently met by membership or acquisition into violent extremist organizations? And lastly, what is the role of trauma and shame in promoting affiliative tendencies and increasing young people's need to achieve change by violent means? There's a strong increase in trend in neuroscience in studying the phenomenon of shame. It tends to dramatically decrease oxytocin in the blood, which means that your need for affiliation will increase, but you'll at the same time tend to self-isolate. So we're trying to see, how do you work around that in giving people positive outlets for belonging and meaning in the context of having experienced shame and or mental health challenges.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's rare that up on this podium we have high science and humor on a very serious subject, so very well done. I want to now segue to you, Maria. Michael's last slide actually talked about the sort of branching point between violent action and nonviolent action. So if you could talk a bit more about nonviolent action as a possible alternative.
Well, thanks very much, Jake. And first, thanks to IPI for hosting what I think is a fascinating conversation. And thanks to Ambassador Scary for opening and contributing to the conversation today. And I don't quite have, Mike's skills in humor and bringing the science together, but I'll do my best to keep it lively. Building very much on Mike's point about kind of the ways in which kind of nonviolent action and nonviolent movements can serve many of the same psychosocial needs that youth and others have compared to violent extremist groups, I think is at the heart of the message and the power of thinking about nonviolent resistance, people power movements, and how they can serve as as an antidote to violent extremism. Just by way of brief background, I've worked most of my professional life with activists, either working with them or writing about them, and have worked with individuals, organizers, activists who have engaged in nonviolent resistance in some of the most difficult places around the world, in places where you would look at the context and the conditions in place and think, gosh, nonviolent resistance doesn't have a chance. It's too tough, too much violence, too much repression. And so certainly the interaction with those individuals, actors, and movements has informed my thinking on this topic. I think the starting point for the conversation is Mike's very important point about the power of belonging. What social movements offer. And again, when we're talking about social movements, we're talking about loose networks of groups, organizations, individuals who have change-oriented goals and who engage in collective action to bring about change. And joining a nonviolent movement offers the same sense of belonging, frankly, as joining any other club, whether that club is a terrorist organization, a violent extremist group. And so there's been some interesting research that has been done, group dynamics theory and others. Tina Rosenberg has written a fascinating book called Join the Club, and she studied why individuals in Serbia, in the youth-led movement and other places join movements, and it was often because their friends joined. Participating in nonviolent action is a very social activity. And so the idea of joining a movement, participating in tactics, sometimes that are higher risk, so that allow young people, others to, kind of meet their need for adrenaline in certain cases, be part of interesting activity, clever tactics that sometimes involve humor, sometimes involve risk, but always involve participating with others in collective action, I think fulfills a very, very important psychosocial role. And also, so the difference in some cases between joining, say, a sports club or, another organization in the community is that what nonviolent resistance is about is having the agency to bring about change. And so by virtue of joining a nonviolent movement, you are, kind of engaging in activity that is bringing about changes in your society and shifting power. And that is very, very appealing to people who often have lived under conditions where they believe they have no power. So joining movements, being able to realize and find power and agency, I think is one of the most compelling reasons why it is such an important piece of the puzzle of preventing violent extremism. Just to take, one concrete example, and I know Nilüfer is going to talk about Afghanistan, but I'm thinking about the case of Burkina Faso. So a place that has experienced violent extremist attacks. 4 years ago in 2014, a social movement that was started by 4 reggae artists who were fed up with the level of corruption, violence, oppression in the society, decided to come together and form a club, if you will, and engage others in a movement to challenge systemic corruption, bad governance in their society. So the name of the movement that they formed is called Belle Citoyenne, Citizens Broom. And so the musicians recruited youth, students, workers, others. They used the broom as a symbol of sweeping away corruption in their society and as a symbol of taking up a broom to clean the streets. So there was both resistance and voluntarism, community action, the constructive program, as Mahatma Gandhi referred to it. So this movement kind of drew on the best traditions of music, of culture, of the tradition from Sankara of revolution to mobilize the population to challenge the president when he attempted to extend his mandate against the Constitution, and they succeeded. So they forced the President Kampwari to step down from power, without the threat or use of violence by mobilizing a mass participation and using all of these creative, active tactics. And so I think the power of participation in nonviolent social movements is what allows people who maybe grew up in rural areas, who never kind of experienced belonging, participating in anything in their lives, have the wherewithal to do leafleting, to join street theater, to join a protest or a boycott. It gives people something to do, meaning, and be part of a moral mission to change their societies. And that's a powerful thing in contexts where extremist groups readily recruit individuals who have grievances but no other outlet to resist. So the kind of the third and final point I would raise has to do with effectiveness. So violent extremist leaders, terrorist organizations want young people and others to believe that the only way to effectively resist tyranny, injustices, corruption, exclusion, inequality is through armed resistance, through violence. You meet violence with counter-violence. You meet profound injustices with violence because it works. And fundamentally, we know and empirically that that is not the case. My colleague Erica Chenoweth and I collected data a few years ago on over 330 violent and nonviolent campaigns over the course of history. These were campaigns challenging formidable, violent, repressive opponents, whether they were incumbent regimes, foreign military occupations. So the similar kinds of authoritarian contexts where you see young people kind of attracted to violent groups and extremist groups. We found somewhat counterintuitively at the time that the nonviolent movements were twice as successful as the violent resistance campaigns. So the nonviolent resistance worked and was very, very effective. So not only could you join a group, belong to a group, feel a sense of power, you can also win. And being on a winning team is kind of an important motivator, I think, in many cases. So we found that the reason why nonviolent resistance has been so much more effective than the armed struggles against these types of opponents is that they attract massively more participants. And so we talked about the whole, again, the social number. The barriers to entry in nonviolent resistance are much lower than in armed struggles. So men, women, young, old, disabled, able-bodied, rural, urban, everybody can participate in some way in nonviolent resistance. And when you see numbers and other people participating because they can, there's a powerful feeling of solidarity and a sense of agency in the fact that we can do something together. And I think that is kind of a really essential element of what allows this type of grassroots activity to challenge violent extremism. So the last point I would note is we also have some research that participation in nonviolent organizing and resistance helps to make communities resilient to violent extremism. So a study done by a colleague, Michael Marcusa, a few years ago, he researched different communities in Tunisia. And he found that those communities that had a history of nonviolent organizing were far less susceptible to violent extremist recruitment. So there were far fewer recruits in the areas that had a history of nonviolent organizing compared to those that did not. So there's something about the skills, the approaches, the historical memory of nonviolent resistance that I think helps to make communities stronger and more resilient to violent extremism. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Maria. You started off by saying that oftentimes we see nonviolent action in places that, because of the level of violence, are some of the least likely places that one would expect to find it. And Nilüfer, you're going to talk about the emergence of a peace movement in Helmand, which traditionally has been one of the most violent, most affected by the Taliban and by the external military intervention in Afghanistan. So, please.
Thank you, Jack. And I would like to thank you, IIP and USIP, for having me over here, and thank you all for being here. Let me be clear, I'm not, currently there's a peace process going on in Afghanistan, so I'm not highlighting on all aspects of peace process, just the bottom approaches and people processes which is happening. Before going to the Helmand peace movement, I would like to reflect a little bit on some of the causes of this peace protests since 2011 onwards, where it is marked as a peace process. So 2011, actually a peace process started. in Afghanistan, especially at the top level. One of the major, usually it's highlighted through many research and studies that grievances caused by the deprivation of material and non-material needs usually considered as a major cause of people's aggression, and that aggression make people fight. So, but in case of Afghanistan, I think that's reverse, because grievances prove to be positive rather than negative aspect. After 2011, soon after the Taliban regime, people started trusting the government, the new system, and they became so hopeful about the new administration in Afghanistan. So they started living life. They started focusing on living their daily life and focusing on education, economic growth. And usually there was a huge optimism around the country on the government of Afghanistan, on the future of Afghanistan. So, but that turned differently. So that trust of people that initiated after 2001 onwards, and that turned differently in from 2007 onwards. So, and it's exactly when the level of violence increased throughout the country. So from 2007 onwards, the violence increased, that there was all kinds of insecurity around the country, and people, daily life, daily routine has been disturbed by that level of violence and different kinds of insecurity, not really a suicide bombing, but the criminal acts and various levels of insecurity around the country. That has reduced the level of trust of people from the government. And I believe that the grievances, and the frustration of people marked from that particular time, where the level of insurgency or violence rised from 2007 onwards. So that actually caused some unpleasant movement initially, but then again the situation calmed down. So in 2011, when the peace processes started, and people were expecting that, okay, now the insurgency is going to be resolved, and there will be another scenario for the political settlement. They started hoping again that things will turn different, which did not happen that way. And again, the high level of insecurity made people frustrated, aggressive, and they started demanding government of Afghanistan for security measures. So throughout the country and different provinces, we have seen small protests happening. People were organizing themselves. They were at the community level. They were talking about all the atrocities which were happening at the provinces. So that is there were some small organic movement based on the sense of insecurity that they felt in their communities. That, though it was not very effective, but at least it was an initiation of a smaller organic movement that we have seen throughout the country, especially in some provinces where the people were a bit aware about what's happening around them. So with the demand that people had in that particular time is better security, and better security, because it was affecting their daily life, and they were not able to participate in the processes. In recent, just at the follow-up of what exactly happened recently, and in March of 2018, with the recent Helmand peace process, which started actually by suicide attack in Helmand, which left behind 40 injuries and many killed. So a group of 8 people organized, 8 young individuals organized themselves, who said enough is enough. And their message of enough of war is because of that high level of violence that has been happening since 2009 that I have mentioned as a background till now. So now that enough of war slogan that this 8 people brought, that we are done with violence, we want peace, and we want security. So, and the group joined these 8 people because they had experienced the same stories. They have some of them based on recent interviews that I have been following. Some of them lost their family members, parents, and these suicide attacks, or brothers and sisters, and some of them lost their children. So they joined these 8 people actually based on shared stories. So, and share stories of high level of violence that all of them were reflecting on and echoing each other. So the movement, so major causes based on, again, interviews of media with this protest movement and leadership. There are few causes that has been highlighted why others joined them and why they started that particular move for the change or to challenge the government and Taliban and to force them for some kind of reconciliation. So the first one is people's perception of being victim of violence. So they thought that now they are the victims. It's no more the elite or the Kabul level political elite who are the victim of this process. It is we as people who are the victim of this process, of this peace process in Afghanistan. Whatever is happening, you guys are doing in Kabul as a government official or Taliban leadership, you guys are not the victim. So it's we as people. We the grassroots. We are the victim. And the second major thing that came out of the interviews with this group is government inability to in peace process and also to maintain security. So they were raising issues that whatever peace process is happening, first we are the victim, secondly government is unable to provide us security. That's why we are facing the consequences. What it was mentioned in the slides, the threat perception of this individual, that okay, now people have died, next is our turn, so we will die also. Their life is threatened now. So many of them joined even when the group start moving from Helmand to northern Afghanistan, and shopkeepers joined them. People from all sectors of life joined them. So I was reading interviews before coming here that some of them said, well, my cousin was killed and there's suicide attack, so next is my turn. So I'm going to be with you. So the people joined from other provinces because it's a threat that they felt to their life and to their physical security and made them join the movement. So threat perception and victims perception are two major elements highlighted from many of these interviews with this protestant. The second one that some of these interviews from other provinces while joining them highlighted seeing no change in their life conditions. So they said that, well, government of Afghanistan has promised to do this and this and this since 2009 onwards, but our life is the same. I mean, we still suffer the same. There's no improvement in life. So why not to join the protest? So there were other joined just because of seeing no really change in their life conditions. And that, again, that relates to unmet non-material needs, such as some of them highlighted lack of recognition and participation in the peace process. The peace process is about us, but we are not in the process. We are not informed what's happening. And it's just happening at the capital. Certain elites are involved, and we people, we even don't know what's happening. So lack of recognition and participation in the peace process overall made some of the people from other provinces join the group. By the way, just to highlight that every province in Afghanistan has its own understanding of violence and understanding of peace even. For some provinces, peace is a political settlement, but for some provinces, peace is the infrastructure and development. So every province in Afghanistan perceives peace differently. That's why even the points that I'm highlighting as causes coming from different provinces means they view peace differently. That's why they join the group based on different perception. And the fourth one that I wanted to mention is that, most of these people also said that, well, it's a belief about their agency of power, that we people have power and we are sure that our movement is going to bring any change. Our movement is going to challenge the government. So some of the interviewees highlighted this agency of power within themselves. So there are four major causes that many of these interviewees overall from various provinces highlighted as the causes of joining this particular movement. The impact, well, no any substantive result on particular current peace process, because Taliban on one hand declined. They said, well, we don't have a fight with you. Our fight is with the top level, and you have to approach the other groups, not us. So Taliban did not really agree to anything. They clearly declined it. And the government, by the way, the government did support verbally their movement, non-civil civil society organizations, religious clerics and groups, and many other networks that supported the movement widely throughout the country. So it was a good mood, and it gave motivation to the protesters and to the movement itself. And but on the other hand, the impact that we have seen during the process and now after the processes is that it educated and mobilized people. And it gave them a sense of people power, that, okay, people can do it when they're moving from province to province, they can bring change. The other is that Afghanistan is ethnically divided country, so it moving from Pashtun a part of the country to another ethnicity, Tajik, it connected the ethnicities, and that's considered as a positive impact on the processes. And so overall, as for conclusion, I would say that such movement, they are still, by the way, active. They are still coordinating with the peace shuras and other local entities in order to spread their message out. But such movement, based on the experience happened in Helmand, would be has a potential to create to mobilize a large number of population from various sectors. First, and the second thing, we have seen that it has a potential of launching a framework for reconciliation, for connecting and bringing peoples together, build relationships, especially in ethnically divided countries. I think it can be used as a good model of bringing the various ethnicities together and create that relationship building model during peace processes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nilüfer. So we're going to open up the floor for Q&A. I thought I'd start out, I have two questions that I wanted to ask. The first is looking at the sort of science behind decision-making that Michael laid out, whether the four of you have thoughts on how to actually translate that into policy and into programming to try and have an impact on the ground. And Michael, I think in one of your slides there was a specific reference to more strategic, better informed strategic communication. And maybe you could say a bit more of that, and if others have other ideas on how this might be useful. The second question I had, and this I suppose is really more for you, Maria, and for Nilüfer, as we were discussing beforehand, but to what extent are we able to say what the necessary conditions are for the emergence of nonviolent movements or people power movements? So we'll put those on the table. Why don't I take one or two from the audience, and then we'll come back to the panel for a first round. So let me open up the floor. Please. And if you could please introduce yourself.
Okay. I'm Catherine Udida from the Permanent Mission of Nigeria. My question actually is, or my comment, it's on what was the conclusions reached by Michael. As you are aware, we have serious issues of violent extremism in Nigeria, especially in the northeastern part of the country. I am aware that there are about 2 local governments in that part of the country where kids have never been recruited. And they have the same social setting, they have the same background, the same religion, but they have never been recruited. So the conclusion that trauma, that almost always children who are recruited may have gone through trauma. That's what I'm trying to question. Also, in the northwest part of Nigeria, with the same social setting, the same drivers, we have not seen them being recruited by Boko Haram. So my take is that basically the drivers of violent extremism in those areas or in whichever country will determine why people join extremist groups. And about nonviolent methods of getting people from joining ethnic violent extremist groups. In Nigeria, we have a group of youth movements, mostly youth clubs where the young people there are actually positive voices in the communities. And so they try to mobilize a lot of grassroots mobilization. In the north central part of Nigeria, you have the herder-farmer conflicts. You see these young people engaging themselves maybe in football clubs and things like that, and then are able to convince their parents that it's better for them to live together instead of fighting. And so those are my comments. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Is there one more from the floor before we come back to the panel?
Thank you always to IPI, and thank you for all your work. My name is Joanna Meyer. During the GI, I went to a meeting at the African Union on Lake Chad and the SDGs, and there was a gentleman there who has 2 PhDs in neurology, and with his colleagues, he's invented all these different machines that can work on PTSD or decreasing the effects of Alzheimer's, any kind of brain trauma. However they have managed it, they have created these different machines. And so I'm wondering if your group knows about them, or if this level of science is being used in the rehabilitation or any segment of how to get us from there to here. Thank you.
All right, why don't we come back to the panel, maybe in the order of speaking, so if there's any particular questions or comments you want to respond to, Noella.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I thought your presentation was really fascinating. I think it really resonates when it comes to how we can support youth groups, in particular in the development of positive messaging. I mean, that's where I see an obvious entry point. But also when it comes to creating the right conditions for a space to actually be safe. I mean, this understanding what these threats actually are, I think can be really useful, and we probably do not do enough, I mean, to include this scientific insight. So really, really interesting. And I wanted to mention we're embarking on the development of a methodology with an organization called SEED, based in Cyprus, around the SCORE index, to look at whether we could predict citizenship choices and how violent or non-violent these might be. So we may want to touch base on that. I mean, that could be an interesting initiative to look at together. If I may add something, I was very interested about what you said specifically about being skeptical about the push for volunteerism. I'm not saying volunteerism doesn't matter, and we're certainly a proponent of that, but I understand what you're saying in terms of not seeing that as a way to really enhance youth agency and really giving a sense of meaningful participation. So I don't know, I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I'll try to touch on all the different comments. Very briefly in response to that, my question is just stepping back. If we were to take the billions of dollars invested in PVE programs, and instead of having invested it in PVE programs, have paved a bunch of roads around the world and actually fixed some of these infrastructural problems, and then did an RCT, I wonder where the money would have been better spent. That's what I mean about that. That was cynical. As far as Jake's comment about translating the science into impact, there's several ways to do that, but the broad frame in all of that is not doing it in a way that vilifies Muslim communities and communities of color, because that's probably how it's going to end up being done unless it's very careful, because that's been a lot of the trends in sort of cutting-edge developments in the field. It's been used to just better surveil and better target. And we see in the United States, I mean, there's all sorts of new extremisms popping up, and it's good to make sure that any of these developments are being applied equally across extremist types. Doing more randomized control trials, figuring out intervention comparisons, interventions that have thrill-seeking components. Take the same intervention, add some thrill-seeking in one, measure oxytocin pre-post, and issues of group fusion and identity and belonging and tendencies towards violence and behavioral outcomes. It's not hard to do rigorous science in the context of implementation. It's hard to do at publication quality because the data is noisy, but that's why you have to have bridge academicians who have one foot planted in academia and another foot planted in policy and implementation science. As far as around Nigeria, I'd be very curious to know why in those two communities, those children are not joining in a sea of other communities that have the same drivers that are, along with youth in the Northwest who are coming from the same sort of ecosystem and milieu of challenges. And if I did in any way say that trauma is guaranteed in the factors, no, it's just a trend that I've seen, and I've seen anecdotally in other studies. And I'd be very curious to know, how can the data that we're collecting in terms of whether it's psychological profiling, how can it be useful to improve different types of interventions, including access to mental health care services, other types of youth programs and community supports? Because I truly think that PCVE programs should be one of many different development investments in a community, insofar as violent extremism is one of many negative choices that youth can choose. My family comes from Guatemala, where there's a ton of gang violence. No one really looks at it the same way because it's not harming embassies or Americans, to be honest. It's a lot of people joining for the exact same reasons, and it's one option of a negative outcome for youth that are plagued by certain psychological and structural phenomena. And then lastly, around the equipment, and a lot of that can be done real cheaply. In terms of, you can get a lot from Fitbits, you can get a lot from a company called Shimmer. They make these really good ECG sensors that you can get heart rate, electrical impulses, all sorts of different things. And that is being done at small scales in different types of interventions.
These are more to heal, not to just take the
On the healing bit, yes. I also think that before we start to bring in Silicon Valley tech, we need to invest more money in figuring out how things like Islamic prayer and native cultural practices for trauma healing work.
Maria?
Yeah. So on the question of how to translate this into policy and practice, I think if the focus is on prevention and really focusing on local ownership and local driving of solutions, taking kind of grassroots movements seriously is important to that conversation. And while I'm not an advocate of dumping a lot of money into movements, and because that can obviously disrupt them, undermine their legitimacy, authenticity, I do think that elevating the voices of those leading these movements is really important. Like having them be part of the policy conversations, whether it's those leading the peace movement in Helmand in Afghanistan, whether it's the Lucha members in DRC, whether it's the Belly Citoyen, just having them part of the conversation to offer a perspective on policy options is really important. We often go to the same 10 NGOs in any kind of society because they speak our language, they've got the right lingo, but activists and movement leaders may not speak the way we would expect, but they have an important story to convey. And I think often, nonviolent resistance has been used all over the world in every culture, religion. There's a tradition of civil resistance in Islam. In fact, my first book focused on the evolution of nonviolent resistance and campaigns in the Arab Muslim world before the Arab Spring. And so I think elevating these stories and kind of supporting education means, kind of media, communication, radio means, to be able to tell the stories. How many people know that the first nonviolent army in the history of the world was led by Muslim Pashtuns? The Huday Hitmatgar movement in Northwest Frontier Province. So things that you don't normally associate with nonviolent resistance kind of exist. So I think kind of amplifying those stories is important. And nonviolent action, movement building is a skills-based activity. So one thing outside actors can do is kind of support activists to learn from each other, movement leaders to learn from each other, to get materials translated, how to navigate challenges, repression, how to bring groups together in difficult contexts. So I think supporting that type of learning is really important. Finally, someone mentioned the civic space. Closing civic space around the world is a fundamental problem for activists and movement leaders. And sometimes the leverage that outside actors have, whether it's military to military, so using military tools to influence the behaviors of militaries who, may engage differently with protest leaders, I think is really important. And just using the diplomatic, military, economic means available to keep civic space open so that the channel can continue along a nonviolent pathway.
Well, Maria has answered all the points. Just in case of Afghanistan, I think I would like to say that it has been now more than 40 years that the generations see only war and violence in a country. So if a child was born 40 years back, now he or she is 40 years, and he or she only saw violence, bombing, suicide attacks, and killing around. So the culture of non-violence has to be taught even very systematically through education institutions, as Maria has mentioned, through a religious institution where people believe has more on that. And the other thing, I think one of the important things, modeling non-violence. Modeling non-violence by political elites. For example, peaceful transfer of power. That, okay, now there's other method of being in power rather than just kill and win. There is other method too. So I think this modeling of nonviolence, even sometimes by military intervention and by the government officials, could also impact how people can build the agency of nonviolence in themselves, and all the other tactics that Maria has mentioned is certainly very much relevant to Afghanistan context as well.
Thanks, Nilüfer. Why don't we come back? I've got Matt Lee in the back, and yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press. This is really interesting, especially I hadn't thought of the science aspect of it, but I heard reference to Kenya and Burkina Faso, and I wanted to ask about another country, which is Cameroon, but also how the UN itself is operating. It seems like it's not necessarily what you would, I guess, call violent extremism, but there is an armed struggle that basically began because the government began to take away rights in the Anglophone area, and I'm just wondering, now it has gotten pretty bad. You had people, students kidnapped, you've had a lot of villages burned down, journalists locked up, and I've sort of seen the UN doing very little about it. And I wondered, beyond just development, what do you think the UN across the street should do when legitimate claims are made initially nonviolently? It seems like they only actually get involved when it becomes violent, and then they issue statements usually condemning the underdog who's fighting back. And I just sort of wonder what, and the other, and this is sort of a smorgasbord. Sri Lanka is one where there was, quote, violent extremism among Tamil Tigers. That was supposedly solved, and now you have a coup situation, or arguably a coup, where the same figures that put down the Tamils are coming back into power. And again, no one's doing anything. So I just wonder, beyond science and development, what do you think politically can be done to cut off what seems to be kind of roots of either the reemergence or the initial emergence of violent fighting, if not extremism? Thanks a lot.
Hi, I'm Maisata from IPI, and I have two questions. First one for Michael. I was wondering if you could specify on which context your research was focusing on, because you mentioned Muslim stereotypes, etc., but I'm not sure I understood which exactly context your findings were based on. And then second question is around the economic incentives around joining violent extremist groups and what nonviolent action can offer in comparison to that, because you said that nonviolent action can offer the sense of belonging, etc., but what happens in terms of the economic incentives? Thank you.
Good question. And we can take one more for this one. Then I'll ask another one, I'll ask another, which is, in a way, building off Matthew's question. I mean, to what extent, I'm particularly thinking of the Arab Spring, but I think it's true in many other places where we see the emergence of nonviolent movements, often in response to government, if not government repression, at least quite fundamental injustice against particular groups in society. And to what extent does the intolerance of nonviolent action actually help trigger more violent forms of response? And is there a sort of correlation between the closing of civic space and less nonviolent action and more violent response? Why don't we go in reverse order? Nilüfer,
I
Yeah.
am making my points.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maria.
I'll be brief. So I think, the intolerance of nonviolent action, it's true, violent repression of nonviolent activists. And someone raised the issue of Cameroon, a good example of a movement for self-determination rights that started nonviolently, faced violent repression and went the violent route. Generally speaking, where there is repression, there is resistance. And I think, often, sometimes violence can motivate people to take up arms, because that's the natural, and that has happened in many places. Sometimes, though, the use of violence against nonviolent protesters can create backfire against the perpetrator of violence and cause people to join more in nonviolent activities. So there's not a kind of a straightforward correlation between government repression and whether a movement goes violent or nonviolent. The data are pretty mixed on that front. And so I think, Cameroon is a case from a policy perspective. We had at least one Cameroonian activist come to USIP and kind of describe the mobilizing they were doing. And I thought to myself, darn it, I hope that international actors are in some way intervening at this point when it's nonviolent, because this is a case where a secessionist movement very quickly could go to armed struggle. And I believe activists are seriously contemplating taking up arms now, and that's kind of the worst case scenario. Their chances of achieving success are much lower once they take up arms than when they do not. And so often it's a case from outside actors, if you can help create space for those activists to plan, to come up with a strategic kind of vision of how to mobilize, organize, deal with repression, that's facing a year out, as opposed to how do we organize next week's protest. I think that can help kind of open up the imagination and space for these activists and movements in the most difficult environments. So creating space for strategic planning and thinking and helping activists learn from each other, I think would have helped Cameroonian activists, and I would imagine activists in other parts of the world.
It reminds me of what happened at the end of 2017 with a couple of nonviolent movement in Kabul, where the government repression or the government force actually either stopped the movement or turned the movement into violence, and killed a number of people from both sides, both from government forces and from the protesters themselves. So I think one of the mistakes that they have done in terms of their movement, I think that it was overall analyzed, was the geography of their movement, where they have allocated that protest, where they ran those protests. So as you have mentioned, in terms of strategic vision or direction, I think geography also matters, that where they are conducting those, especially if it's protest, where they are conducting those protests, and how government feel threatened at once, that maybe their offices will be attacked or their authority will be undermined. So I think they should, if they have been more strategic in terms of being a little bit away from the center of the town or from the capital of the office's capital, I think they would not cause that force by the government, and which not stopped or turned into violence their movement. So geography also does matter in terms of deciding about the strategic movement of their nonviolence.
Thank you. I really agree with all these points. I think we'll take the question on economic incentives. I think we've seen in the different studies in which we have interviewed also former members of violent extremist groups that economic incentive actually doesn't come at the top. Which doesn't mean that you do not need to be able to have livelihoods and the salary potentially, but really these economic incentives are far less important than the sense of belonging, the sense that you can actually influence policymaking and be part of the solutions. On nonviolence movement, I think another aspect that has to do with prevention and perhaps has to do also with the sense of belonging and the meaningful participation is also formal participation in politics. I think we haven't raised that issue, and it would be interesting to have perhaps more data or more evidence of how nonviolent movements in the civic space and in civil society can actually trigger more effective formal political participation. I find that very often we look at these two issues separately, and being at the table and feeling that you're part of an extractive exercise of voicing your concerns, etc., is really different from being part of the implementation, being part of accountability mechanisms, etc. So it'd be great to actually think about something with USIP on that. That's it.
Just to mention, our research at the moment is being done in Jordan, Kenya, and the United States, and hopefully soon expanding to Burkina and Nigeria. That was the only...
I have a comment about economic investment. In terms of economic incentives, I think, I don't know, I believe that is, especially in the context that I worked, particularly with these indigenous groups, I think that would damage the movement. And that is not, maybe it's a good thing, but it would certainly, because a couple of initiatives started during peace processes which had economic incentives for the participants to join the group. And it turned out to be very negative at the end. It turned to be, people hijacked the process. They were all political entities who came in the process and hijacked the entire movement. So it turned, and different neighboring countries entered into the processes. So I think, at least in the context I worked, it proved to be negative rather than positive, while you put strategy for economic incentives in such nonviolent movements.
Jay, can I just add something about what Maria was raising around support for activists and in terms of the run-up to when things become violent? I think Matt brought up an important point there. That just an anecdote from Jordan, I was working with a young activist named Adam. He was a poet and a singer. And he was doing various NGO programs in Zatari camp. And he wrote some brilliant proposals to try to get some small seed funding to expand his Poetry of Resistance program, to try to teach other young Syrians about how you can leverage singing and songwriting and writing poetry as a form of maintaining your connection to the homeland while also speaking your mind about political developments or developments in the conflict. He could get zero support for any of that. And then 6 months later, I see him again after he had been through an intensive 2-week armed training program with the British on the Jordanian side of the Syrian border with the Free Syria Army. That's where he found support for something that wasn't his idea and was not a peaceful form of resistance. And that's not me taking a political stance. It's just saying we do invest disproportionately in people find support in certain types of movements more than they do in others. And so that's about how we set this up for people.
Aha. All right. I have 2 questions here and there. Why don't we start over here? Michael's coming with the microphone.
Thanks very much. Sapna with Strategy for Humanity. This is a question probably for Maria. We can talk about it later, but I wanted to ask it since we're in the UN context and environment. So given Matt's question about what the UN role is, what the UN as member states, as UN agencies, departments, NGOs, I'm really struck by this question of the elephant in the room, non-interference, sovereignty. How can we really go around talking about nonviolent action when, in the end, we don't want to be promoting overthrowing governments, overthrowing systems, right? It's counterintuitive. So I'm wondering if through your research, or maybe anyone else here on the table at the panel, can talk about some of the campaigns and initiatives that the UN can get behind that aren't about challenging sovereignty. They're not about challenging government control over their populations, but there's so it's really just a question of the scenarios that would be successful under, and whether there's examples that you can talk to.
And we'll take one final question.
Thank you so much to all for the wonderful presentation and really empowering us as well. I did to link what I heard, listened, understood in terms of SDG 10, reducing inequalities and nonviolence. So it is, direct outcome when the inequity is high, 91 percentage versus 99. So that when that stands, it's kind of fits naturally as part of the world political system. Extremism, it also connects with the economic incentives. So how we can linkage with the nonviolence movement on the global level with the reducing inequalities with the SDGs 10. Thank you.
Great. So a question really about how to promote responsible sovereignty and around the SDGs and the promotion of inclusive. So we'll come back to the panel for one final round of responses. Maria, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, just in response to Sapna's question about sovereignty, I think, when it comes to supporting activists and movements, it's not about supporting the outcomes of what they're after. So it's not about outside actors being like, we want regime change, we're going to support nonviolent activists. The most important point is helping those committed to nonviolent means express and use their fundamental human rights. So even if that were the frame, allowing people freedom of assembly and association, freedom of speech, freedom of access to information, that more than anything is what outside support, I think, to activists and movements really means. And so I understand absolutely the concern about sovereignty. I also think that, we know from, other experiences, humanitarian intervention beyond, that sovereignty as well is challenged when governments engage in systematic human rights violations. And so I think that recognizing the right of people to live in a society without violent repression and where they're able to have some say in the decisions that affect their lives is one of the most important things we can do to support peace and security in these places. So many movements start with an anti-corruption focus, for example, a women's rights focus. Ballet Citoyens began purely on a corruption focus, and then it challenged the abuse of power. So fundamentally the status quo was disrupted. This wasn't anything that outside actors did. It was just those were the fundamental goals of the movement at that point, to challenge the abuse of power. Boko Haram in part began as an anti-corruption movement as well, and kind of went down a different pathway at a certain point. So I think the sovereignty is a concern, but I think the bottom line is, if you're really interested in sustainable peace, meaning peace with justice and respect for fundamental rights, kind of supporting those who are committed to achieving that and advancing that nonviolently is in the interest of the United Nations and other outside actors.
Yeah, I think then it is very contextual. I was thinking about Iran nonviolent movement, and whenever we follow through the news, what Iranians are demanding through this nonviolent movement is regime change. So that is what exactly how people frame their messages. So the goal of the movement is the important thing is working as a guiding principle for whatever strategies they develop. So in terms of Afghanistan, let's say the goal hasn't been regime change. The goal has been to hold, especially in this peace process, the goal has been to either hold government accountable for the security of the people, and on the other hand, speed up the negotiation processes between Taliban and Afghan government. Get it done, bring reconciliation. So the goal has been clear. So I think overall, if you see sometimes the movement in African countries and around the world, the goal is important, and then it's sometimes, for Iran, it might undermine the sovereignty of regime, certainly with the goal that the groups, the leadership of this protest groups have, but in Afghanistan it is different. So, and then that's how they develop a narrative within the movement, and build their strategies, objectives, and tactics based on those narratives. So it is very contextual. Sometimes, yes, it's undermined, and when it's the goal, so let it to be undermined. That's fine. The sovereignty is undermined, and people are struggling. That's people's demands for change. But at least in the case of Afghanistan, that hasn't been the case. That's accountability of the government.
Really, I mean, I think I completely agree. I think we cannot just go with the business case. The human rights promotion is an end in itself as well. Of course, by that we mean the promotion of the human rights of the victims, of the whole community, of the perpetrators as well of violent extremist acts. So yes, very much agree with other colleagues on that. On the link with the SDGs, obviously with the SDG 10, with the SDG 16, obviously with the link with peace and security work. There are many ways in which we can do that. I think involving nonviolent movements and civil society movements in general, and youth groups in fleshing out, in lending, I mean, the agenda at local level, in making sure that they can be part of the accountability mechanisms, of the review, of the monitoring, of the reporting here at the global level, at national level, etc., is really key, and something we support in a number of countries.
All right, great. Let me then invite Leanne to the podium for concluding remarks.
Hi. So first of all, thank you to IPI for hosting and moderating this extremely rich discussion. We've heard from the panelists from, I would say, very disparate angles, but very connected. And I hope that all of you have taken away some real common threads the way that I have. I think that there's a lot that's going to benefit policymakers and practitioners who are interested in a more comprehensive approach to both preventing violent extremism and promoting sustainable peace. It's really clear to me from what we heard today and from all of the research that we've been reading for many years now, that when it comes to violent extremism and its expression in dozens of countries, hundreds of communities, that it's not an easy diagnosis. Like Mike, I would urge everybody to have extreme skepticism on another thread, which is any type of monocausal understanding of terrorism. If you hear that there is one reason at the local level or at the global level, I would suggest extreme skepticism with that mentality. And that's because violent extremism at its core is an extremely human challenge. We easily forget this because the most virulent violent extremist groups today are so violent, they're so nihilistic, they're horrible to civilians and armed actors alike. And so we forget the fact that this is a human problem, but ultimately these groups only exist as long as people still join them. So around the world, in differing local contexts, violent extremists are extremely adept at making the case for why radical change is possible, and then they recruit aggrieved individuals to be part of this twisted vision of change. And so, as we heard today, the ways in which terrorists recruit people, mainly young people, to join their cause, have significant neural, emotional, and psychological components. If group identity and the perception of power are part of what makes these groups attractive, then we need to be thinking more creatively about alternatives that give young people vehicles to fill those needs positively, with something that's good for their societies overall. As we heard today, nonviolent action really fits the bill. Participation in nonviolent action is a powerful potential response. And as neuroscience has shown us, and what we saw, is that being part of a group is really important. I think the stories that we tell each other about our groups are incredibly important as well. Earlier this week, I was having a conversation with somebody who was a 20-year veteran in a particular type of law enforcement, and he was talking about something. He didn't know he was talking about neuroscience, but he was. He was saying that every criminal that he's ever encountered has rationalized, projected, and minimalized what they were doing, and they were doing that to avoid shame. They want to feel okay with the extra normative behavior that they're doing, and I think that rehumanization of criminal activity with the context of shame, I'm sure Mike can teach me a lot more about that, but I think that that's a way in which we can also understand the things that terrorists tell you that they're doing may be very different from the reasons that they're actually part of that group. One of the things about nonviolent action that I heard today that I think is incredibly powerful is about agency. Rather than having outside experts analyzing the drivers of radicalization, people power movements allow communities themselves to define the grievances that are most impacting them and then chart out a path to address those challenges. And it's effective empirically. So everybody wants to be part of a winning team, and we have something to say on the empirical side that this actually works. And then anecdotally, we heard about Afghanistan, where it's perhaps the most important moment of peace, and it's built on the pillars of nonviolent action. I mean, what Nilüfer said about modeling nonviolent action in the political space to allow for some of the movement at the grassroots space, I think is a really powerful lesson for us all to take. Thirdly, I think what we heard today really allows us to see how certain types of movements deliver on their promises where other ones fail. And when I think of violent extremist groups, terrorists really promise agency to young people, and they don't deliver. They instead use violence and fear to keep them in a really totalitarian dictatorial group. And so where nonviolent movements, as Maria was talking about, they really deliver on the concepts of not just agency, but of collective action, where people share power among participants instead of allowing just a few to exert power over the masses. So I would say in closing, for thousands of years, humans have derived strength from our collective ability to communicate, to plan, and to work together. So we need to do a better job at understanding the ways to harness that productively and in ways that meaningfully connect with, particularly youth. I think it's really key to preventing violent extremism, but perhaps most importantly, it's really key to promoting sustainable peace. So thank you to IPI and to Norway and to everyone who's here today.
Thanks so much. Let me similarly again express my deep thanks to the government of Norway and to you, Ambassador Skare. And please join me in once again thanking our panelists today.